The dust cloud rising from the stagecoach could be seen for miles across the Montana plains, and Garrett Brennan watched it approach with equal parts dread and hope as he stood outside the Ruby City Depot on that scorching August afternoon in 1882. He had not expected to take out an advertisement for a mail-order bride, but the loneliness of ranch life and the encouragement of his younger sister had worn down his resistance until he found himself corresponding with a woman named Clara through an agency in San Francisco. The letters had been brief and formal, her handwriting neat but oddly uniform, and when the stagecoach finally rolled to a stop in front of him, kicking up red Montana dirt, Garrett straightened his shoulders and prepared to meet the woman who would become his wife. The driver climbed down first, then opened the door with a flourish that seemed wasted on the small crowd gathered. Two men in business suits stepped out first, barely glancing at the welcoming committee before heading toward the Ruby Hotel. Then a young woman appeared in the doorway, her face partially obscured by a worn blue bonnet, her dress simple but clean, her hands clutching a single carpet bag as if it contained everything she owned in the world. When she looked up and her eyes met his, Garrett saw something there that surprised him. Not fear exactly, though there was uncertainty. Not cunning or calculation, but rather a deep, quiet intelligence mixed with profound vulnerability. "Miss Clara Sutherland?" he asked, removing his hat as he approached. She nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly, and descended the steps with careful precision. Up close, he could see she was younger than he had imagined from her letters, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair that escaped in wisps from beneath her bonnet, and eyes the color of strong coffee. She was pretty in an understated way, her features delicate but her hands showing signs of hard work. "I am Garrett Brennan," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Ruby City." She took his hand briefly, her grip uncertain, and then released it. Her lips moved as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded again and held her carpet bag tighter. "The wagon is just over here," Garrett said, gesturing toward the buckboard he had driven into town that morning. "The ranch is about 8 miles out. My sister Sarah is there. She is excited to meet you." Clara followed him to the wagon without speaking, and Garrett found himself filling the silence with observations about the town, the weather, the condition of the road. She nodded occasionally, her eyes taking in everything around them with what seemed like intense concentration. When he helped her up onto the wagon seat, she flinched slightly at his touch, then settled herself with that same careful precision she had shown descending from the stagecoach. The ride out to the ranch stretched long and uncomfortable. Garrett made several attempts at conversation, asking about her journey, about San Francisco, about whether she had traveled far to reach the coast. Each question was met with a nod or a shake of the head, but no actual words. He began to wonder if perhaps she was simply shy, or perhaps she regretted her decision and could not bring herself to speak to him. The letters had been brief, yes, but they had been cordial enough. He pulled the folded pages from his jacket pocket at one point, thinking to reference something she had written about enjoying the outdoors, but when he glanced at her face, he saw such stark panic there that he quickly put them away again. "Are you feeling well?" he asked. "The journey from San Francisco is long. You must be exhausted." She nodded, relief washing over her features, and turned her attention back to the passing landscape. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in August. The grasslands spread out golden and endless, interrupted by stands of cottonwood and pine. A creek ran parallel to the road for a stretch, its water clear and cold from mountain runoff. Garrett pointed out various landmarks, his own nervousness making him more talkative than usual. the old settler's cabin that had been abandoned after a harsh winter. The place where the road forked toward the mining camps higher in the hills. The edge of his property, marked by a fence he had built himself 3 years ago when he first claimed this land. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, and Garrett felt the familiar mixture of pride and inadequacy he always experienced when returning home. It was not a grand structure, just a simple 2-story wooden building with a covered porch and a stone chimney, but he had built it with his own hands, and it was sturdy and weathertight. The barn stood nearby, larger than the house, along with a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, and horses moved in the corral. It was a working ranch, modest but prosperous enough, and it represented everything Garrett had worked toward since arriving in Montana territory 5 years ago. Sarah came running out before the wagon had fully stopped, her skirts hiked up in a way their mother would have scolded her for, her face bright with excitement. At 17, she still had the enthusiasm of childhood mixed with the emerging awareness of a young woman. She had been after Garrett to find a wife for over a year, ever since their mother had passed away back in Ohio, and it had become just the two of them trying to manage the ranch. "You must be Clara," Sarah called out, not waiting for introductions. "Oh, I am so glad you are here. The house has been nothing but men and dirt for too long. Come down, let me help you." Clara descended from the wagon with Sarah's assistance, and Garrett noticed how she studied his sister's face, that same intense concentration he had observed earlier. Sarah chattered away, taking Clara's bag, gesturing toward the house, pointing out the garden she had been trying to maintain without much success. Clara nodded along, and something in her posture seemed to relax slightly. "You must be famished," Sarah continued. "I have stew on the stove, and I baked bread this morning." "Well, I tried to bake bread. It might be a bit heavy, but it is edible. Garrett says I will learn eventually, but I think he is just being kind. Come inside, please. Your room is upstairs, the one with the window facing east. You will get the morning sun, which I think is lovely, though Garrett says it will wake you too early. But I like waking with the sun, do you not?" Garrett followed behind the two women, carrying Clara's single carpet bag, struck by how small it was. Everything she owned apparently fit in one bag. The thought made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. Inside, the house was clean if somewhat sparse. Sarah had done her best to make it welcoming, putting wildflowers in a jar on the table and airing out the rooms, but it still had the feel of a bachelor's residence, functional rather than comfortable. "Let me show you upstairs," Sarah said, already heading for the narrow staircase. Clara followed, and Garrett handed over the carpet bag. "I will see to the horses," he said. "Come down when you are ready." He escaped to the barn, grateful for a moment alone to collect his thoughts. The mare and gelding he had driven into town needed to be unhitched and brushed down, given water and feed. The familiar tasks steadied him. He had built his life around such tasks, the daily rhythms of ranch work, the clear relationship between effort and result. Animals and land made sense to him in ways that people often did not. His wife, he had died 3 years ago shortly after they arrived in Montana, succumbing to pneumonia during their first winter. The grief had been sharp but bearable, tempered by the fact that theirs had been an arranged match, affectionate but not passionate. His mother had followed 2 years later, simply worn out by life, or so the doctors said. Now it was just him and Sarah deserved better than to spend her youth keeping house for her brother, hence the advertisement. Hence Clara. When he returned to the house an hour later, he found Sarah setting the table while Clara stood by the stove stirring the stew. Sarah was still talking, narrating her activities with the same bright energy she brought to everything. "I was just telling Clara about the town, about how Ruby City used to be much bigger during the gold rush but has settled down now. We have a general store, a church, a school, the hotel, and of course the saloon, though I have never been inside. Garrett goes sometimes, but only for business, not for drinking. He is very responsible that way. Are you very hungry? I am absolutely starving. I think the excitement has given me an appetite." They sat down to eat, and Garrett watched as Clara carefully observed how Sarah served the food, how she passed the bread, how she ladled stew into bowls. Clara mimicked these actions precisely when her turn came, her movements economical and exact. The food was simple but good, and Sarah kept up a running commentary that required no response, which seemed to suit everyone fine. After dinner, Sarah insisted on showing Clara around the rest of the house, though there was not much to see. Kitchen and parlor downstairs, 3 bedrooms upstairs. The tour took all of 10 minutes. Then Sarah declared she needed to check on the chickens and left with exaggerated casualness, clearly trying to give Garrett and Clara time alone together. The silence that descended felt heavy. Garrett cleared his throat. "The wedding is planned for Sunday, if that suits you. Pastor Mitchell will perform the ceremony after the regular service. Sarah has been telling everyone in town, so there will likely be a gathering afterward. People are curious about you." Clara's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. "Or we could wait longer if you need time to settle in," Garrett added quickly. "I do not want you to feel rushed." She shook her head and made a gesture that he interpreted as agreement to the original plan. Then she stood and began clearing the dishes, moving to the basins Sarah had filled with heated water. Garrett watched her work for a moment, noting the competence in her movements, the way she handled the dishes with care despite their plainness. "Your letters mentioned you grew up in San Francisco," he said, trying once more to draw her into conversation. "That must be quite different from Montana." She paused in her washing, her shoulders tensing, but did not turn around or respond. The silence stretched again. "I suppose you must find it very quiet here," Garrett continued, feeling increasingly foolish. "Ruby City is not much of a city, really, more of a town. But the people are good, mostly. Hard workers, families trying to build something, still nothing." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, frustration mixing with concern. "Clara, I know we are strangers. I know this situation is unusual, but if we are to be married, it would help if we could talk to each other." She turned then, her face stricken, and to his horror, tears began sliding down her cheeks. She shook her head frantically, her hands twisting in her apron, and then she fled, running up the stairs so quickly he heard her stumble on the landing. Garrett stood in the kitchen, stunned and completely out of his depth. Sarah came in through the back door, took one look at his face and sighed. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing. I just asked her about her letters, about San Francisco. She started crying and ran upstairs." Sarah shook her head. "Men, you probably frightened her. She seems very shy. Give her time." But it was more than shyness, Garrett thought as he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling. Something else was wrong, something he could not identify. The way she had looked at those letters, the panic in her eyes, the careful way she mimicked Sarah's actions, the complete absence of any spoken words, the next morning brought no clarity. Clara came down early before Sarah, and had coffee brewing and biscuits baking when Garrett entered the kitchen. She nodded a greeting and poured him coffee without being asked, setting the cup before him with the same careful precision she brought to everything. The biscuits, when they came out, were perfect, golden and flaky, far better than anything Sarah had managed. "These are excellent," Garrett said. "Thank you." A small smile crossed her face, the first he had seen, and it transformed her completely. For a moment she looked almost happy. Sarah appeared and exclaimed over the biscuits, and then the morning routine consumed them all. There were eggs to collect and animals to feed, garden weeds to pull and water to haul. Clara threw herself into every task with determination, following Sarah's lead but quickly showing her own competence. She knew how to work, that much was clear. Her hands were efficient with the chickens, gentle with the eggs. She moved through the garden with care, distinguishing weeds from vegetables with ease. By midday, Garrett found her in the barn, studying the horses. She had approached the chestnut mare slowly, hand extended, letting the animal sniff and accept her before attempting to touch. When she stroked the mare's neck, her whole body relaxed in a way he had not seen before. "That is Daisy," he said from the doorway. "She is gentle, good for riding if you know how." Clara turned, startled, then looked back at the horse with such longing that Garrett made a decision. "Would you like to learn? To ride, I mean. I could teach you if you do not know." The smile again, broader this time, and an eager nod. Over the next few days, a routine established itself. Mornings were for chores, the three of them working together to keep the ranch running. Afternoons, Garrett spent teaching Clara to ride, starting with the basics of approaching the horse, then bridling and saddling, then finally mounting and learning to sit properly. She learned quickly, her natural athleticism and careful observation serving her well. Sarah often joined them, the three of them riding out to check fence lines or move cattle, and during those rides, with the wind in their faces and the vast Montana sky overhead, Clara seemed most at ease. But still, she did not speak. And increasingly, Garrett became convinced that the issue was not shyness or stubbornness. Something else was at play, some barrier he could not identify. On Friday afternoon, 2 days before the wedding, he rode into town to finalize arrangements with Pastor Mitchell and pick up supplies from the general store. Millicent Foster, who ran the store with her husband, was eager for information about the mysterious mail-order bride. "Sarah says she is lovely but very quiet," Millicent said as she measured out flour and sugar. "Is it true she has not said a single word since arriving?" "She is adjusting," Garrett said diplomatically. "It is a big change coming all this way." Of course. "But still, you would think she would talk to her intended husband, unless there is some problem." "No problem." Millicent's eyes gleamed with curiosity, but she let it drop, instead packing his supplies and accepting payment. Garrett was loading the wagon when Pastor Mitchell approached, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a thoughtful manner. "Garrett, I am glad I caught you. I wanted to discuss the ceremony." "It will be simple," Garrett said. "After the Sunday service as we planned." "Yes, but I need to review the vows with both of you beforehand. Would Miss Sutherland be able to come into town tomorrow, or I could ride out to the ranch if that is easier?" Garrett paused in securing the supplies. "The ranch would be better, I think. Tomorrow afternoon, certainly." "I will see you then." Pastor Mitchell hesitated. "Garrett, is everything all right? Sarah mentioned that Miss Sutherland has been somewhat reticent." "She is fine, just quiet." "I only ask because marriage is a serious commitment, and both parties should enter into it freely and with full understanding. If there are any concerns, any reasons to delay—" "There are no concerns," Garrett said, perhaps more sharply than intended. "We will see you tomorrow, Pastor." He drove home troubled, wondering if he was doing the right thing. A marriage of convenience made sense on paper. He needed help with the ranch and companionship. She needed security and a home. They did not need to love each other, not at first. Affection could grow over time as it had with his first wife. But what if Clara truly did not want this? What if her silence was actually refusal and he was too obtuse to recognize it? When he arrived home, he found Sarah in the garden while Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with strong, rhythmic movements. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Pastor Mitchell is coming tomorrow to review the ceremony with us, with both of us." Her hands stilled in the dough. She did not turn around. "Clara, if you do not want to go through with this, you need to tell me. I will not force you. I will give you money to return to San Francisco or to go wherever you want. But I need to know." She turned then, and the anguish on her face shocked him. She shook her head violently, then pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. She pointed at him, then at herself, then made a gesture of two hands coming together. She wanted the marriage, or so he interpreted. But the tears on her face told a more complicated story. "Then what is wrong?" he asked, moving closer. "Please help me understand." She looked around frantically, as if searching for something, then grabbed the flour sack from the counter and held it toward him, pointing at the lettering on the side. Then she shook her head and pointed at herself. Garrett stared at the letters spelling out the mill's name. Then understanding began to dawn, cold and shocking. "You cannot read," she nodded, tears flowing freely now. "That is nothing to be ashamed of," he said quickly. "Many people cannot read, it is no matter." But she was shaking her head again, pointing at the letters, then at her own eyes, then shaking her head more emphatically. She grabbed his hand and traced letters on his palm, random, meaningless patterns. Then she pointed at the letters on the flour sack and made the same gesture, showing him that to her they were all just meaningless marks. "You cannot read," he said slowly, "or write. The letters I received, they were not from you." She nodded, then sank into a chair, her face in her hands. The whole deception became clear. Someone at the agency had written those letters on her behalf. She had agreed to the arrangement without being able to read his letters in return or write her own. She had traveled across the country to marry a stranger based entirely on what others had told her, unable to verify anything herself. And now she was terrified he would reject her for this deficiency. Garrett pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Look at me, please." She lowered her hands, her face wet with tears, eyes red. "I do not care if you can read," he said. "It does not matter to me. You are hardworking and kind. You are good with animals and plants. You make excellent biscuits." A small sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a sob. "But you can talk, can you not? You just choose not to." She hesitated, then nodded. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound, but the word that emerged was so garbled and unclear that Garrett barely recognized it as language. She tried again, and he realized she was attempting to say his name, but her tongue seemed unable to form the sounds properly. The humiliation and frustration on her face was painful to witness. "You have difficulty speaking," he said gently. Another nod. She tapped her head, then her mouth, then made a gesture of something being blocked or broken. Born this way, he understood. She could hear and understand perfectly, but she could not read or write, and her speech was so impaired that she had learned to stay silent rather than suffer the mockery or confusion her attempts at words caused. "Can you speak at all?" he asked. "Even a little?" She made another attempt, and this time he caught fragments. Simple words, heavily distorted but recognizable if he concentrated. "Yes. No. A few basic needs." But anything more complex became unintelligible, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt until she gave up, slumping in defeat. Garrett sat back, his mind racing. The agency had sent him a woman who could not read, write, or speak clearly, without warning him of any of this. They had taken her money, or someone's money, and shipped her off like defective goods, hoping he would not send her back. The anger he felt at their deception was hot and immediate, but beneath it was something else. Pity for Clara, yes, but also a kind of admiration. She had undertaken this enormous journey, traveling alone to an unknown fate, unable to communicate with anyone along the way. The courage that required was staggering. "Can you read lips?" he asked. "If I speak clearly, watching my face, does that help?" She nodded eagerly, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on his mouth. He spoke slowly and deliberately, exaggerating his lip movements slightly. "We will work this out together. You and I will learn to understand you and you will learn to understand me, and I will teach you to read if you want to learn." Her eyes went wide. She pointed at herself, then mimicked opening a book, then shook her head as if the idea was impossible. "Why not?" Garrett asked. "You are clearly intelligent. Reading is just symbols that represent sounds and words. If I can learn to understand your speech, you can learn to recognize letters. It will take time and patience, but we have both." She stared at him for a long moment, hope and disbelief warring on her face. Then she attempted another word, and though it was distorted, he understood it clearly enough. "Why?" "Because you deserve to know what the flour sack says," he replied. "And because I want to receive letters from you, even if I have to teach you how to write them first." She began crying again, but this time with something that looked almost like happiness. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it tightly, and Garrett felt something shift in his chest. This strange, silent woman who made perfect biscuits and communicated in gestures and struggled so hard to be understood was going to be his wife. Not the wife he had imagined based on those false letters, but someone real and complicated and brave. Sarah burst into the kitchen at that moment, saw them holding hands across the table with Clara crying, and immediately assumed the worst. "Garrett, what did you do now?" "I did nothing," he said. "We were just talking." Sarah looked at Clara's face, then at their joined hands, and her expression softened. Talking. Finally. The next afternoon, Pastor Mitchell arrived as promised, riding up to the ranch on his elderly mule. Sarah served coffee and cake in the parlor while the pastor reviewed the ceremony. "It is very simple," he explained. "I will ask you both if you take each other as husband and wife. You will each say, 'I do.' Then you will be married in the eyes of God in the territory of Montana." "Do you have any questions?" Clara looked at Garrett, her expression anxious. He turned to the pastor. "Clara has difficulty speaking," he said carefully. "Her hearing and understanding are perfect, but forming words is hard for her. Can she nod instead of saying the vows aloud?" Pastor Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "I was not aware of this condition. Neither was I until yesterday, but it does not change anything. She understands the commitment she is making." The pastor studied Clara thoughtfully. "Miss Sutherland, do you understand that marriage is a lifelong covenant? That you will be bound to Garrett Brennan in the eyes of God and the law?" Clara nodded firmly, then made a conscious effort to produce sound. What came out was unclear, but the affirmative intent was obvious. "Can you say 'I do', even imperfectly?" She tried, the sounds mangled but recognizable enough. The pastor nodded slowly. "Then I see no impediment. The church recognizes that we are all created different but all equal in God's sight. If you can express your consent, that is sufficient." He smiled at Clara. "I look forward to welcoming you to our congregation tomorrow." After he left, Sarah hugged Clara impulsively. "See, everything will be fine. Now we need to decide what you will wear. I have Mother's good dress, the blue one. It might fit you with some adjustments." The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparations. Sarah was in her element, organizing and planning, while Clara allowed herself to be measured and fitted, the blue dress needing only minor alterations to accommodate her smaller frame. Garrett escaped to the barn, and the familiar work of mucking stalls and checking on a cow that was due to calf soon. His mind kept returning to Clara, to the revelation of her struggles, to the way her hand had felt in his. He had thought he was entering a practical arrangement. Instead, he was beginning to realize this might become something more complicated and potentially more meaningful than he had anticipated. That night, unable to sleep, Garrett went downstairs and lit the lamp in the kitchen. He found paper and a pencil and sat at the table, thinking. Then he began to write, large and clear, printing rather than using cursive. He wrote the alphabet, each letter carefully formed. Then he wrote simple words: Clara, Garrett, Sarah, ranch, horse, cow, bread, water. He was still working when Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a borrowed nightgown and shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, softer, and Garrett felt his breath catch slightly. "I could not sleep either," he said, gesturing at the papers. "I thought we could start your lessons, if you want." She approached slowly, looking at the papers with a mixture of longing and fear. She pointed at the first word he had written, her name, and looked at him questioningly. "Clara," he said, pointing at her. "This is you. These letters make the sounds that form your name." He sounded it out slowly, pointing to each letter. C making a hard sound. L-A-R-A. She watched intently, then picked up the pencil with a trembling hand. He guided her fingers, helping her trace the letters of her own name. The first time through, her movements were uncertain. The second time, more confident. By the fifth repetition, she was writing Clara without his help, the letters shaky but recognizable. She looked up at him with such pure joy that Garrett felt something warm unfold in his chest. On impulse, he took the pencil and wrote beneath her name, "Beautiful." Then he pointed at her and nodded. She read the word, or at least looked at it intently, and he realized she did not know what it said. So he touched her face gently and said the word aloud. "Beautiful." Understanding lit her features, followed by a blush that colored her cheeks pink. She took the pencil and carefully copied the word, her letters crude but determined. Then she wrote Clara again, and beneath it, "Beautiful." They worked for another hour, Garrett teaching her more letters, more simple words, Clara absorbing everything with fierce concentration. He learned to speak slowly, to face her so she could read his lips, to use his hands and expressions to clarify meaning. She learned to attempt sounds, pushing through her embarrassment when the words came out wrong, trying again when he did not understand. It was slow and often frustrating, but they were communicating. Finally, Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, yawning. "Some of us are trying to sleep. And tomorrow is the wedding, remember? You both need rest." Reluctantly, they parted for the night. But as Clara climbed the stairs, she turned and attempted one more word, garbled but just clear enough. "Thank you." "You are welcome," Garrett replied, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and the promise of heat later in the day. Sarah was up before dawn, helping Clara dress in the blue gown, arranging her hair, chattering with nervous energy. Garrett put on his best suit, the one he wore for funerals and formal occasions, and tried to calm his own nerves. This was his second marriage, but it felt more significant than the first had. Perhaps because he was older and more aware of what the commitment meant. Or perhaps because of Clara herself, this woman he barely knew but who had already surprised him in so many ways. They rode into Ruby City together, the three of them in the buckboard, arriving just as people were gathering for the morning service. Garrett felt the weight of curious stares as they entered the church, Clara's hand tucked into his elbow, Sarah walking proudly beside them. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture, Pastor Mitchell's sermon about love and commitment taking on new resonance. Then the congregation shifted, making space at the front, and suddenly, Garrett was standing before the altar with Clara beside him, her hand trembling in his. Pastor Mitchell smiled at them both. "Dearly beloved, We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. The familiar words washed over Garrett as he looked down at Clara. She was staring straight ahead, her face composed but her hands giving away her nerves. He squeezed her fingers gently, and she glanced up at him, a small smile touching her lips. "Garrett Brennan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Garrett said clearly. "Clara Sutherland, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Clara nodded, then pushed sound from her throat, the words distorted but unmistakable. "I do. By the power vested in me by the Montana Territory and by God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Garrett, you may kiss your bride." Garrett turned to Clara, saw the mixture of hope and anxiety in her eyes, and decided to keep it simple and respectful. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a chaste gesture that nevertheless made her cheeks flush. The congregation applauded, and then they were surrounded by well-wishers, people introducing themselves to Clara, women welcoming her to the community, men clapping Garrett on the shoulder. A gathering followed at the church social hall, tables laden with food that the various families had brought. Clara stayed close to Garrett's side, nodding and smiling as person after person greeted her. He noticed how carefully she watched faces, trying to read lips and expressions, and he made sure to introduce people slowly, to give her time to process. Millicent Foster cornered them near the punch bowl. "Welcome to Ruby City, Mrs. Brennan. We are so glad to have another young woman in the community. You must come to our sewing circle on Thursday afternoons. We meet at the church." Clara glanced at Garrett, uncertainty clear on her face. He spoke slowly, facing her. "The ladies meet on Thursday afternoons to sew together and talk. You would be welcome to join them." She nodded at Millicent, who beamed. "Wonderful. I will see you this Thursday then." After she left, Clara touched Garrett's arm and made a sewing motion with her hands, then pointed at herself and looked questioning. "Can you sew?" he interpreted. She nodded. "Then you will do fine. They will be happy to have you." The afternoon wore on, and Garrett watched his new wife navigate this world of strangers with quiet determination. She could not contribute to conversations, but she listened intently, and her expressive face communicated much. When someone complimented the food, she smiled. When children approached shyly, she was gentle and patient with them. When old Mrs. Henderson told a long story about her late husband's antics, Clara laughed silently but with genuine mirth. They left as the sun was beginning to descend, Sarah immediately falling asleep in the back of the buckboard, exhausted from the excitement. The ride home was peaceful, the land gilded with late afternoon light. Clara looked out across the plains, and Garrett wondered what she was thinking. This was her home now. He was her husband. The full weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders. At the ranch, Sarah roused herself enough to hug them both and then retreated to her room, declaring herself done with people for the day. Garrett and Clara stood in the kitchen, suddenly alone and very aware of their new status. Married, husband and wife. "Are you tired?" Garrett asked, speaking carefully so she could read his lips. She shook her head, then pointed outside to the sunset. "You want to watch the sunset?" A nod. So they went out to the porch and sat on the steps, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep red as the sun sank behind the mountains. Cattle lowed in the distance. A hawk circled overhead. The air cooled and sweetened. Clara leaned against Garrett's shoulder, a tentative gesture, and he put his arm around her, equally tentative. They sat like that until full dark, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Then, without words, they rose and went inside. At the base of the stairs, Clara paused and looked at Garrett, a question in her eyes. He understood what she was asking. Where did they go from here? He was not sure himself. His first marriage had been conventional, expectations clear. But this felt different, newer, requiring more thought. "Your room is still yours," he said slowly, making sure she could see his face. "Nothing has to change tonight. We have time." The relief on her face was obvious, followed quickly by something that looked almost like disappointment. But she nodded and climbed the stairs to her room while Garrett retired to his own. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the house settle, thinking about the woman sleeping down the hall. His wife. Clara Brennan now, not Sutherland. A woman who could not read her own name but who had just copied it in careful letters at the kitchen table. A woman who struggled to speak but whose silence said so much. He was still awake when he heard soft footsteps in the hall, then a gentle knock on his door. "Come in," he called. Clara entered, wrapped in her shawl, carrying the papers from their lesson. She held them out to him, pointing at words, clearly wanting to practice. Garrett lit the lamp and patted the space beside him on the bed, keeping a respectful distance. They sat side by side, papers spread between them, and he taught her more words. Husband, wife, home. Love, she traced love with her finger, then looked at him questioningly. "It is something we grow," he said, speaking slowly, "like plants in the garden, with time and care." She considered this, then took the pencil and carefully wrote below the word, time and care. Her letters were getting steadier, more confident. Then she wrote her new name, Clara Brennan. "Yes," Garrett said, touching the words. "That is who you are now." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while, the lamp burning low, papers scattered around them. Eventually, her breathing deepened into sleep. Garrett carefully extracted himself and carried her to her room, tucking her into bed like a child. She barely stirred. He returned to his own room and finally slept. The next days fell into a new pattern. Mornings were for ranch work, all three of them cooperating to manage the endless tasks. Clara proved herself capable with animals, patient with temperamental cows, gentle with skittish horses. She worked in the garden with Sarah, coaxing vegetables to grow despite the harsh Montana sun. She learned to make cheese and butter, to preserve fruit, to manage the complex household economy that kept the ranch running. Afternoons, when the heat drove them indoors, Garrett taught Clara to read. They started with the alphabet, drilling the letters until she could recognize them all. Then, simple words, building her vocabulary one term at a time. She was a determined student, practicing whenever she had a free moment, writing letters in the dust, tracing words on frosty windows, slowly building a bridge between herself and the written world. Evenings, they sat together, sometimes reading aloud from the Bible or newspapers, Garrett going slowly so Clara could follow along, her finger tracing the words. Sometimes they just sat in companionable silence, Sarah knitting or mending while Clara practiced her letters, and Garrett repaired tack or reviewed account books. It was a peaceful domestic life, and Garrett found himself grateful for it. Clara went to the sewing circle that first Thursday, and Garrett drove her into town, planning to pick her up a few hours later. When he returned to the church, he found her surrounded by women, all of them talking animatedly while Clara smiled and nodded. Millicent Foster caught his eye and beckoned him over. "Your wife is a marvel with embroidery," she said. "She cannot speak much, but her needlework speaks for her. Look at this." She held up a handkerchief Clara had been working on, and Garrett saw delicate flowers embroidered in the corner, the stitches tiny and precise, the design beautiful. Clara ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise but pleased. "She will fit right in with us," another woman, Helen Briggs, said. "We do not need words to be friends. Good work and a kind heart are worth more than chatter." On the way home, Clara was more animated than Garrett had seen her, pointing at things and making gestures that he interpreted as her describing the afternoon. The women had been welcoming. They had shown her their projects. They had invited her back. She was building a place for herself in the community, and it showed in her brightening demeanor. As summer faded into autumn, Garrett realized he was falling in love with his wife. It crept up on him gradually, not the passionate rush of youth, but something deeper and steadier. He loved the way she bit her lip when concentrating on her letters. He loved how she sang wordlessly to the horses, tuneless humming that nevertheless soothed the animals. He loved her determination to learn, her patience with setbacks, her quiet strength. He caught himself watching her as she worked in the kitchen, hands busy with dough or vegetables, her profile serene in the afternoon light. He found excuses to sit close to her during reading lessons, to touch her hand when passing something at the table, to brush her hair back from her face when the wind tangled it. She seemed to lean into these touches, to seek them out, her own hand finding his with increasing frequency. One night in late September, after Sarah had gone to bed and they were alone by the fire, Clara showed Garrett what she had been working on. She had written him a letter, the first she had composed entirely by herself. The letters were uneven and the spelling creative, but he could read it. "Dear Garrett, thank you for teaching me words. Thank you for patience. Thank you for bringing me to Montana. I am happy here. I am happy with you. Your wife, Clara." Garrett read it 3 times, his throat tight with emotion. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "I am happy with you too," he whispered into her hair. She pulled back enough to look at his face, making sure she could read his lips as he spoke. "I love you, Clara. I did not expect to, but I do." Her eyes filled with tears, and she attempted the words back, the sounds garbled but the meaning unmistakable. "I love you." He kissed her then, properly this time, not the chaste gesture from their wedding but a real kiss full of feeling. She responded with equal passion, her arms winding around his neck, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. That night, Clara did not return to her own room. They became truly husband and wife in every sense, their union tender and careful, full of whispered endearments and gentle touches. Afterward, lying tangled together in Garrett's bed, Clara traced letters on his chest, spelling out words she was learning. Home. Love. Forever. "Forever," Garrett agreed, kissing her temple. "You and me forever." The next morning, Sarah took one look at them at breakfast and rolled her eyes. "Finally, I thought I would have to lock you two in a room together." Clara blushed scarlet, and Garrett tried to look stern but failed. They were happy, genuinely happy, and it showed in everything they did. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountains, Clara's reading improved dramatically. She could now manage simple books, sounding out unfamiliar words with Garrett's help. She wrote letters to Sarah when his sister visited friends in town, just for practice. She kept a journal, recording daily events in her improving script. The world of written language was opening to her, and with it came a new confidence. She also became braver about attempting speech. Around Garrett and Sarah, in the safety of home, she tried more often to form words, accepting their patient help when sounds would not come right. She learned to use shorter words that were easier to pronounce, to supplement with gestures and written notes when necessary. It would never be easy for her, but it no longer trapped her in complete silence. Winter arrived in earnest, snow piling deep around the ranch, the world shrinking to the warm circle of home. They spent long evenings by the fire, Sarah reading aloud while Clara followed along in her own copy, Garrett working on plans for spring improvements. When blizzards kept them trapped inside for days, they played cards and word games, Clara's vocabulary expanding with each round. When the snow finally stopped and they could venture out, they bundled up and tramped through the white landscape, checking on livestock, hauling feed, keeping the animals alive through the harsh Montana winter. One frozen January morning, Clara was sick for the first time since arriving. Garrett found her in the kitchen, pale and shaking, clutching the edge of the table. Fear shot through him. Illness in winter could turn deadly fast, but when he asked what was wrong, she gave him a wavering smile and placed her hand on her stomach. Understanding dawned slowly. "Are you with child?" She nodded, then attempted the word, "baby." Joy and terror warred in Garrett's chest. A baby. They were going to have a baby. Clara was watching his face anxiously, trying to gauge his reaction. "That is wonderful," he said, pulling her into a careful embrace. "That is the best news." Sarah shrieked when they told her, immediately beginning to plan and prepare, talking about baby clothes and cradles and all the things they would need. Clara submitted to her sister-in-law's fussing with good humor, though she looked overwhelmed by the attention. That night, alone in their room, Clara showed Garrett what she had written in her journal. "Baby coming, scared, happy, both." "I am both too," Garrett admitted, "but we will manage, we always do." She cuddled against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, already protective of the tiny life growing inside her. His family was expanding. The ranch, the home he had built with his own hands, was filling with love and life and future. The pregnancy progressed through the long winter and into early spring. Clara continued her reading lessons, determined to be able to read to their child. She sewed tiny clothes, her skilled fingers creating beautiful garments from scraps and remnants. She grew rounder, her movements slower but her spirit bright. Garrett found himself constantly worried about her, fussing over her health until she rolled her eyes and shooed him away. "She is pregnant, not made of glass," Sarah pointed out one afternoon when Garrett tried to prevent Clara from hanging laundry. "Let her work. She will tell us if she needs rest." In early April, as the snow finally began to retreat and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, Clara went into labor. Sarah rode for the doctor while Garrett stayed with Clara, holding her hand through the contractions, feeling helpless in the face of her pain. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, and Garrett aged years in those hours, terrified of losing her. But when dawn broke, filling their bedroom with golden light, the cry of a newborn finally split the air. The doctor, an elderly man named Peterson who had seen hundreds of births, wrapped the baby and placed the bundle in Clara's arms. "A boy," he announced. "Strong lungs. Good color. Congratulations." Clara looked down at their son, tears streaming down her face, and attempted the words, "Our baby." "Our son," Garrett agreed, his own eyes wet. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved aimlessly. Garrett touched one of those fists, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "What will you name him?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her face soft with wonder. Garrett looked at Clara, and she carefully wrote letters in the air. "Gee," he understood. She wanted to name the baby after him. "No," Garrett said gently. "He should have his own name. What do you like?" Clara thought, then attempted. "James?" "James Brennan," Garrett said, testing it. "I like that." So James it was. The baby thrived, growing plump and healthy on his mother's milk. Clara was a natural with him, patient and gentle, somehow managing to soothe him even when she could not sing proper lullabies. Garrett spent hours just watching them together, his wife and his son, marveling at how his life had changed in less than a year. As spring turned to summer, Clara continued to improve her reading and writing. She read simple stories to James, even though he was far too young to understand, just for the practice. She wrote letters to the women in her sewing circle, getting responses that delighted her. She kept detailed records of James's growth, documenting his first smile, his first laugh, all in her increasingly confident script. One afternoon, Garrett found her in the garden with James bundled on a blanket nearby, a book open in her lap. She was reading on her own, not sounding out words but actually reading, her eyes moving smoothly across the page. He stood watching, pride swelling in his chest. She had worked so hard for this, practiced so diligently, overcome so much. As if sensing his presence, Clara looked up and smiled. Then she carefully pronounced, "I love you, Garrett." The words were still imperfect, some sounds not quite right, but they were clear enough. He had understood perfectly. "I love you too," he replied, sitting beside her in the garden, their son sleeping peacefully nearby, their home solid and sure around them. "More than I can say." She took his hand and placed it over the book, over the words she had been reading. He looked down and saw it was a simple primer, the kind used to teach children. But for Clara, it represented a universe that had been closed to her, now opened wide. She turned the pages, showing him how far she had progressed, her face alight with accomplishment. That evening, the whole family, Garrett, Clara, Sarah, and little James, sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of purple and gold. The ranch was prospering, the cattle healthy, the harvest promising. James would grow up here, learning to ride and work and read from parents who understood the value of both hard work and patient teaching. "You know," Sarah said, breaking the peaceful silence, "when you first put out that advertisement, I worried no one would respond. Montana is a long way from anywhere, but I think God sent exactly the right person." Garrett looked at Clara, saw her attempting to puzzle out what Sarah had said, and repeated it slowly so she could read his lips. Clara smiled and nodded, then attempted her own response. "God sent me here, to home, to family, to us," Garrett added, pulling her close, "and we are never letting you go." As the stars began to emerge overhead, Clara rested her head on Garrett's shoulder and spelled letters on his palm, a private communication they had developed. He translated easily now, understanding her meaning even when the letters were unclear. She was telling him about her day, about James, about the bread she wanted to bake tomorrow. Simple, domestic things, the stuff of daily life, but to Garrett it was everything. This woman who had arrived unable to read her own name now read to their son. This woman who had hidden in silence now attempted speech, trusting him to understand. This woman who had been sent like a package, sight unseen, was now his partner, his love, his wife in every sense. Love truly had no language, he realized. It existed in patient teaching and determined learning, in gentle touches and knowing glances, in the quiet building of a life together, brick by brick, word by word. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. A second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Garrett's sister, arrived 2 years after James. Clara's reading advanced to the point where she could manage most books with only occasional help. She never became a fluent speaker. The physical difficulty remained, but she learned to combine simple words with gestures and written notes so effectively that most people in Ruby City understood her easily. The community had embraced her completely, and children in town called her Aunt Clara, knowing she would always have a kind word, even if she had to write it down. Sarah eventually married a young rancher from the neighboring property, moving only a few miles away, but leaving Garrett and Clara to manage the house alone. Clara had become an excellent manager, keeping accounts and inventory with meticulous written records. Her literacy opened doors she had never imagined as a frightened young woman stepping off that stagecoach. James and young Sarah grew healthy and strong, learning to read from both parents, their father teaching them letters as he had taught their mother. They learned patience from watching their parents communicate, understanding that love was not about perfect words but about the effort to connect. On their 10th anniversary, Garrett surprised Clara with a gift. It was a book, leather-bound and beautiful, but when she opened it, the pages were blank. A journal for her to fill with her own words. "Write our story," he said, "for our children and grandchildren, so they will know where they came from." Clara clutched the book to her chest, tears in her eyes, then carefully pronounced, "Our story. Love story." "The best love story," Garrett agreed, and over the following years Clara did exactly that. She filled the journal with her account of that terrifying journey from San Francisco, of arriving unable to read or write, of the patient rancher who taught her that love had no language. Her writing improved with each page, her voice emerging clear and strong on paper even as it remained halting in speech. She recorded the births of their children, the challenges of ranch life, the deep satisfaction of building something lasting. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived when Clara was 30. By then, she was thoroughly established in the community, respected for her skill with animals, her beautiful needlework, her kind heart. The fact that she could not speak clearly was simply part of who she was, no more remarkable than the color of her hair. The women in her sewing circle had learned to understand her, and children in town knew that Mrs. Brennan might not talk much, but she always listened. As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Garrett's careful management and Clara's meticulous record-keeping made them successful enough to hire help, easing the constant labor. They built a larger house, with a proper parlor and separate rooms for each child. Clara finally had a real kitchen with a modern stove, and she filled it with the smells of baking bread and simmering stews, the heart of a home filled with love and laughter. James grew into a serious young man, taking after his father in temperament and build. He was patient and thoughtful, excellent with animals, and everyone assumed he would take over the ranch eventually. Young Sarah was bright and sociable, her mother's determination combined with her father's steadiness. Thomas, the baby, was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. Clara taught all three children to read, just as Garrett had taught her. She knew the value of literacy better than most, understood how it could open worlds. Her children would never struggle as she had, never feel trapped by their inability to access written language. But she also taught them that words were not the only way to communicate, that love and patience and determination could bridge any gap. One evening when James was 15, he asked his mother about her past. They were in the kitchen, Clara kneading bread while James did homework at the table. Sarah and Thomas were already in bed, and Garrett was in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. "Mama," James said, "can you tell me about when you came here? About meeting Papa?" Clara paused in her kneading, thinking about how to answer. Her speech had improved over the years. She could manage short sentences now. Though they required effort, but for complicated stories, she still preferred to write. She wiped her hands and sat down across from him, pulling over a slate they kept in the kitchen for quick notes. She wrote, "What do you want to know? Why did you come so far? Were you not scared?" "Very scared," she wrote, "but wanted better life, wanted family." Papa said you could not read when you arrived, that he taught you. Clara nodded, then attempted speech. Could not read, could not write. Could not talk well. But your papa patient. He teach me, he love me anyway. Did you love him right away? Clara smiled at the romantic question. She wrote, learn to love, like learning to read, takes time and practice. James digested this, then asked, do you wish things had been different? That you could talk like other people? It was a question Clara had pondered many times over the years. She could have been bitter about her limitations. She could have raged against the unfairness of being born with a tongue that would not cooperate, a brain that could not decipher letters without intense effort. But bitterness would have poisoned the good life she had built. She wrote carefully, I am who I am. God made me this way. Your papa love who I am. You children love who I am. I love who I am. Different is not bad, but it must be hard sometimes. Always hard, she wrote. But hard things make us strong. I am strong because I had to be. James nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom. Then Clara reached over and ruffled his hair, smiling. She added on the slate, you are strong too. All my children strong. Because you learn patience and love from watching Mama and Papa. When Garrett came in from the barn an hour later, he found Clara and James still talking, or rather, James talking and Clara writing responses, both of them comfortable with this hybrid form of communication. The scene made his heart swell. This was what he had hoped for when he first started teaching Clara her letters. Not just that she would learn to read, but that she would pass on everything she had learned, would show their children that obstacles could be overcome with love and determination. The years continued to unfold. James did eventually take over most of the ranch operations, working alongside his father, learning the business from the ground up. Young Sarah developed a talent for teaching and took a position at the Ruby City School, following in her mother's footsteps in a different way, helping others learn. Thomas, ever curious, studied engineering and left Montana for a while to work on the expanding railroad system, though he promised to return. Garrett and Clara grew older together, their love deepening with time. They developed their own private language, a combination of gestures, expressions, and Clara's still improving speech that allowed them to communicate complex ideas quickly. To outsiders, it sometimes looked like they were reading each other's minds, but it was simply the result of decades of practice, of learning to truly listen to each other. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch. Sarah had married and brought her husband and 2 children. James had recently wed a local girl, steady and kind like his mother. Thomas came home from his railroad work, full of stories about the changing world. The house was loud with conversation and laughter, children running through rooms, multiple generations sharing space and love. After dinner, when the younger children were in bed and the adults sat on the porch watching stars, James's wife asked Clara about her journal, the one Garrett had given her years ago. I have heard you have been writing your story, she said. Would you share it sometime? Clara glanced at Garrett, who nodded encouragingly. She had been working on that journal for years, adding to it periodically, refining her account. It had started as simple documentation, but had evolved into something more thoughtful, a meditation on communication and love and overcoming obstacles. Clara attempted speech, still careful but much improved. We'll share, but remember, is just one story. Every person has story, every love different. But yours is special, young Sarah insisted. You and Papa built something beautiful from nothing. You could not even read your own name, and now you have written a whole book. Not finished, Clara said, smiling. Still writing. Story not over while we live. Then what would you say is the most important part? Thomas asked. If you had to pick one lesson from everything you have learned. Clara thought for a long moment, then laboriously spoke. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not need perfect words, just need willing hearts. Garrett reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers as he had done thousands of times before. She is right. When Clara first arrived, I thought the most important thing was teaching her to read and write. But I was wrong. The most important thing was learning to love each other. The reading and writing just made daily life easier, but we could have been happy without them. We could not have been happy without learning to really see each other, to value each other as we are. Clara squeezed his hand, then added with effort, He teach me more than words, teach me worth, teach me I matter. You have always mattered, Garrett said softly. From the moment you stepped off that stage, coach, scared and brave and determined, I just helped you see it. The night wore on, family members drifting off to bed one by one until it was just Garrett and Clara left on the porch, as it had been so many nights over the years. The Montana sky spread overhead, vast and star-filled, the same sky that had watched over their courtship and marriage, the births of their children, the building of their life together. No regrets. Garrett asked, speaking slowly out of long habit even though Clara could now follow most normal speech. She shook her head, then attempted a longer sentence than usual. Best thing I ever do. Come here, marry you, learn to read, have family. Best life. Best life, Garrett agreed. I love you, Clara Brennan, today and always. She managed the full response, the words she had practiced for decades. I love you too, Garrett, forever and always. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had learned each other's languages so thoroughly that words were often unnecessary. The ranch slept around them, animals settled for the night, children and grandchildren dreaming under the same roof. Everything they had built home, family, love stood solid and sure, a testament to patience and determination, and the belief that everyone deserved to be understood. As the years advanced and Garrett and Clara moved into their 60s, life on the ranch settled into a gentle rhythm. James and his wife, Margaret, took over day-to-day operations, living in the new house they had built a short distance from the main house. Garrett and Clara had more time for each other, more time for the small pleasures they had earned through decades of hard work. Clara's reading had progressed to the point where she consumed books voraciously, making up for all the years she had been locked out of written language. She joined a book discussion group in Ruby City, communicating through written notes and short-spoken phrases, her opinions valued for their insight rather than their eloquence. She also began teaching adults who had never learned to read, understanding their struggles and fears better than anyone. Her students loved her patient methods, her refusal to judge, her living proof that it was never too late to learn. Garrett watched his wife flourish in these later years and felt profound gratitude. The scared young woman who had arrived unable to read her own name had transformed into a confident, capable woman who helped others find their own voices. She had not just learned to read and write. She had learned to claim her place in the world, to insist on being seen and heard and valued. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted down from the cottonwoods and the air carried the first hint of coming winter, Clara finished her journal. She wrote the final entry in her careful script, then sat back and reread the entire volume from beginning to end. It was her story, told in her own words, proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she had built something worth remembering. That evening she showed it to Garrett. "Finished," she said, the single word clear. He took the leather-bound book reverently and opened to the first page. There, in handwriting that had evolved from shaky and uncertain to confident and strong, Clara had written, "My name is Clara Brennan. I could not read those words when I first came to Montana in 1882. I could not write them. I could barely speak them. But a patient man taught me that love has no language, and he was right. This is our story. Garrett read the entire journal over the following week, transported back to those early days of their marriage, seeing events through Clara's eyes. She had captured moments he had forgotten, recorded feelings he never knew she had, created a portrait of their life together that was both intimate and universal. Anyone who read it would understand what it meant to struggle against limitations, to work hard for small victories, to build love one patient day at a time. This should be published, Garrett said when he finished. Other people should read this. Clara shook her head vigorously. Just for family, she attempted. For children, for grandchildren. But it could help people, people who struggle like you did, people who think they cannot learn or change or grow. Your story would give them hope. Clara considered this, then wrote on her ever-present slate, maybe after we gone. Now just want to live. Enjoy time with you. Garrett could not argue with that. They had earned their quiet years together. So the journal was placed on the shelf, a private record of an extraordinary, ordinary life. More grandchildren arrived, James and Margaret having 3 children in quick succession. Young Sarah and her husband had 2. Even Thomas eventually returned from the railroad and settled down, marrying and starting his own family. Clara delighted in all of them, the house often full of children who called her grandma and clamored for her attention. She could not tell them elaborate stories out loud, but she learned to convey just as much through animated gestures and expressive faces. The grandchildren did not see her disabilities. They just saw Grandma, who always had time for them, who taught them to sew and garden and ride, who wrote them special notes they treasured. On their 40th anniversary, the family threw a grand celebration. The whole community turned out, people whose lives Clara and Garrett had touched over the decades. Former students of Clara's reading classes testified to her patience and skill. Families whose children had been taught by their daughter Sarah thanked them for their legacy. Ranchers who had worked with Garrett and James praised their fair dealing and hard work. When called upon to speak, Garrett stood and looked out at the assembled crowd, then down at Clara beside him. She nodded encouragingly, and he began. 40 years ago, I was a lonely man trying to build a ranch and a life in this beautiful, harsh land. I put out an advertisement for a mail-order bride, expecting a practical arrangement, nothing more. What I got was something far better and more complicated. I got Clara. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Clara arrived unable to read, unable to write, barely able to speak. I will not lie and say that was easy. It was not, but it taught us both something crucial. Words are not what matter most. Connection matters. Patience matters. The willingness to meet someone where they are and help them grow, while being willing to grow yourself, that matters. Clara reached up and squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. Over these 40 years, I have watched my wife learn to read and write, watched her help dozens of others do the same. I have watched her raise children who are kind and strong. I have watched her build a community around herself through sheer force of character. But more than any of that, I have simply loved her. And that, friends, has been the greatest privilege of my life. The applause was thunderous. Then, to everyone's surprise, Clara stood. She rarely spoke in public, uncomfortable with her garbled words. But today she wanted to try. She looked at Garrett, took a breath, and slowly, carefully worked to form words. Thank you for patience, thank you for love. Thank you for teaching me I matter. Best 40 years. Want 40 more. Her speech was still imperfect, words running together and sounds not quite right. But in the silence following her words, everyone understood perfectly. This was love, real and hard-won and lasting. This was what it looked like to build something meaningful one patient day at a time. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually, Garrett and Clara slipped away to the porch of their original home, now occupied by James, but still holding so many memories. They sat on the same steps where they had watched sunsets 40 years ago, where Garrett had first put a pencil in Clara's hand and taught her to write her name. "No regrets?" Garrett asked again, the question he had asked so many times over the years. "Never," Clara managed. "You?" "Only that I cannot give you another 40 years, but I will give you as many as I have left." They sat in the darkness, two old people who had loved each other through youth and middle age and into their elder years, who had built a family and a legacy and a love story worth remembering. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, their children and grandchildren sleeping under various roofs, animals settled in barns, the land itself bearing witness to decades of care and cultivation. Clara leaned against Garrett's shoulder, comfortable in silence. But then she pulled out a small notebook she always carried and wrote by moonlight, "I would marry you again." Every time, in every life, Garrett read the words, his heart full. "And I would teach you to read again, every time, in every life, though I think you could probably teach yourself now." She laughed silently, shoulders shaking, and wrote, "Probably, but like learning from you, like having excuse to sit close and hold hands and pretend we studying." "I knew you were doing that," Garrett said, grinning. "Clever woman." They stayed on the porch until the moon set, and the stars began to fade, talking in their hybrid language of words and gestures and deep understanding. By the time they finally went to bed, the eastern sky was lightening, another Montana dawn breaking over the land they had claimed and cultivated and called home. The years that followed were gentle. Garrett's health began to fail slowly, his joints stiffening with arthritis, his movements becoming more careful. Clara remained more robust, her lifetime of hard work keeping her strong. She cared for him with the same patience he had once shown her, helping him when needed but never coddling, respecting his independence even as age diminished it. They still had their reading time each evening, though now it was often Clara reading aloud to Garrett, her speech slow but clear enough for him to follow. They reviewed her journal together sometimes, laughing at memories, marveling at how far they had come. Garrett encouraged her again to consider publishing it, but Clara remained firm. It was for family, a private record of a private love. In the spring of 1922, 40 years after Clara had first arrived in Montana, Garrett fell ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a fever that would not break, a weakness that steadily increased. The doctor was kind but honest. At 70, recovering from such illness was difficult. They should prepare themselves. Clara refused to accept it. She nursed Garrett with fierce determination, sitting by his bedside day and night, reading to him, holding his hand, willing him to live through sheer force of love. The children came and went, paying respects, saying what might be goodbyes. But Clara would not say goodbye. On the third night, Garrett woke from fever dreams to find Clara asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still clutching his. Love for her rushed through him, so strong it was almost pain. She had been the great gift of his life, the unexpected blessing. He had thought he was rescuing her, teaching her, giving her opportunity. But she had given him so much more purpose and partnership, and a love that had sustained him through 4 decades. "Clara," he whispered. She woke instantly, leaning forward. "I am here. I need to tell you something." "Save strength. Do not talk." "No, listen." He took a breath, gathering his words. "You were scared you could not read your own name, but Clara, you could always read the things that mattered. You could read animals and land, you could read people's hearts, you could read love. That is a more important literacy than any other." Tears streamed down her face. "Do not leave me." "Not leaving, never leaving, will be with you always." In James's face, in Sarah's laugh, In every word you read because I taught you. In every sunset you watch from our porch, I will be there." "Not ready," she sobbed. "Want more time." "Me too." "But Clara, we had 40 good years. We were lucky. We got to build something beautiful. We got to love each other well. That is more than most people ever have." She climbed into bed beside him, something she had not done in days for fear of jostling him. But now she lay in his arms, her ear against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you," she said clearly, the words she had practiced for 40 years, the most important words she knew. "I love you too," Garrett replied, "always and forever. Every life." He died near dawn, quietly and peacefully, with Clara in his arms and their family gathered around. He simply took a breath and then did not take another, slipping away as gently as he had lived. The grief was enormous. Clara felt as if part of her had been torn away, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. But even through the pain, she felt grateful. Grateful for 40 years. Grateful for the patient man who had seen past her limitations to the person inside. Grateful for a love that had sustained them both. The funeral was large, the church packed with people whose lives Garrett and Clara had touched. Person after person spoke about Garrett's fairness, his kindness, his skill as a rancher, and his warmth as a friend. But Clara barely heard them. She was lost in memory, reliving 40 years in the space of an hour, remembering everything from that first dust-choked arrival in Ruby City to their last conversation as dawn broke. After Garrett was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, Clara returned to their home, now so empty without him. Sarah wanted her to come stay with them, but Clara refused. This was where she belonged, surrounded by memories of Garrett and their life together. She lived another 8 years, staying active and engaged despite her grief. She continued teaching reading to adults, continued writing in notebooks and journals, continued being a presence in her grandchildren's lives. But she was waiting, really, to join Garrett. She said as much to James one evening when he stopped by to check on her. "I am not trying to die," she wrote. "But when it comes, I will welcome it. I miss him every day." "I know, Mama, we all miss him. But you have wives, children, full lives. Mine was full too. Now it is finished, just waiting to finish final chapter." In the spring of 1930, as flowers bloomed and the ranch came back to life after winter, Clara died peacefully in her sleep. She was 70, and her heart simply stopped, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and deep feeling. Her children found her in the morning, a notebook open on her lap. She had been writing, adding one final entry to her journal. "James, read the last words she had written. Today I read 10 pages. Helped 2 students with their letters. Watched the sunset. Thought of Garrett constantly. I am tired but content. I have lived a good life, loved deeply, made a difference. If I do not wake tomorrow, know I was ready. Tell my children and grandchildren I love them. Tell them love has no language but speaks in every kind action, every patient teaching, every moment of true connection. Tell them I could not read my own name when I arrived in Montana, but I learned to read everything that mattered. And the most important thing I ever read was the love in Garrett's eyes when he looked at me. That love taught me who I was. That love made me whole." Clara was buried beside Garrett on the hill, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and dates. But their real monument was the family they had raised, the ranch they had built, the community they had served, and the love story they had lived, a story that proved patience and kindness could overcome any obstacle. That true connection required no perfect words, and that love, in the end, was the only language that really mattered. Years later, young Thomas, the original Thomas's grandson, named for his great-uncle, discovered Clara's journal in the ranch house attic. He read it cover to cover in one sitting, tears streaming down his face as he absorbed his great-grandmother's story. Against her explicit wishes, but with his family's blessing, he arranged to have it published, feeling that her story was too important to remain hidden. The book, titled Love Has No Language, became a quiet success, resonating with readers who saw themselves in Clara's struggles, who understood what it meant to face obstacles and overcome them through determination, and the support of those who loved them. Schools used it to teach empathy and persistence. Literacy programs adopted it as inspiration. And in Ruby City, Montana, a small museum was established in the old ranch house, preserving the memory of Clara and Garrett Brennan, the mail-order bride who could not read her own name and the patient rancher who taught her that love transcends language, living on in action and memory and the lives we touch along the way. Their story became legend in Montana, told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in it. But at its heart, it remained simple. Two people, flawed and uncertain, who chose to see each other clearly, to meet each other with patience, and to build something lasting through daily acts of love. They proved that heroism is not always dramatic, that transformation can be gradual, and that the most profound revolutions happen in the quiet spaces between two hearts learning to truly understand each other. In the end, Clara had been right. Love had no language. It spoke in Garrett's patience as he taught her letters, in Clara's determination as she struggled to learn. In the home they built together, the children they raised, the land they tended, the community they served. It spoke in 40 years of shared sunsets and morning coffee, of hands held and hurts comforted, of two people who chose each other every single day. And that love, that wordless profound connection, echoed down through generations, teaching everyone who heard their story that we all have something to offer, something to learn, and someone who will see us truly if we are brave enough to let them. Clara could not read her own name when she arrived in Montana, but she learned to read everything that mattered, and in doing so, she wrote herself into history, proving that every person, no matter their limitations, has a story worth telling and a love worth celebrating. That was the legacy of Clara and Garrett Brennan, and it lived on long after their bodies returned to the Montana soil they had loved so well.